Right. Well, I'm assuming most of you got a pretty rough idea of what AUKUS involves, but I'll just go over a couple of the basics just to get us started. There was an agreement signed between the Australian, US and UK governments during the dying moments of the Morrison government in September 2021. And its main features were these. Firstly, the purchase and construction of at least 8 nuclear-powered submarines, and this rather controversially, at least for the mainstream media, it also involved the cancellation of an existing contract for conventional French submarines. Neither here nor there, instinctually. Second was the exchange of nuclear military technology, which was sort of implicit in purchasing these machines. And the third was a much expanded long-range missile program. Now, at the time this came out of the blue, no one was really expecting it. There hadn't been much debate about it, and certainly that continued. And certainly that continued throughout the election campaign. And when Albanese came to office, one of the first things he did in March 2023 was to confirm that Australia would be holding to the contracts under AUKUS and would be prosecuting the AUKUS agreement. And he provided a timeline. In 2023, the Australian military and civilian staff would be embedded with US and UK submarines and other military staff. It would involve presently over 100 naval personnel being seconded to the US where they're embedded in the submarines, and that's been taking place during the current Iran war, including on the USS Minnesota, which was the submarine which torpedoed the Iranian frigate on the 4th of March, killing 140 sailors. It also includes, and these have already started as far as I know, forward rotations of US and UK subs to Australian ports from 2027. And in the early 2030s, subject to the approval of the US Congress, the sale by the US of 3 Virginia-class subs to Australia. The late 2030s, the UK to deliver its first AUKUS sub to Australia, and the early 2040s, Australia to produce its own nuclear-powered submarine. Now, the reason for going through some of this detail is that the detail is what most of the mainstream coverage of this has been focused on. I want to talk about much broader political issues than that, but it's important we have at least some idea of how the detail all fits in. Now, much of the initial criticism focused on the viability of the whole plan and on the whole scheme, and doubts whether the US or the UK could actually deliver it. For example, a recent conference a couple of weeks ago in Sydney, hosted by former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, had one of its speakers, the Rear Admiral Peter Briggs, and he was quoted in the Sydney Morning Herald as saying, "AUKUS was a wasteful folly. We're facing the loss of a submarine capability. It is never too late to stop a plan that is not going to bloody well work. We are heading for a train smash." So there's hardly uniform agreement amongst the military establishment about the plan, but nevertheless, the Albanese is ploughing ahead with it. Others have argued, and it's a related argument, that the increased Australian naval power in Southeast Asia still won't guarantee that merchant vessels will continue to travel through zones such as the Malacca Straits in the event of China. And the Malacca Straits, about 95% of Australia's maritime trade comes through that zone. And related again to that the US, particularly under Trump, is simply too capricious and unreliable to bank on for such a long-term agreement over the next 20, 30 years. Now, our criticisms to this are fundamentally different to those of the defence insiders and most of the mainstream media and political coverage. The first thing, and this is something which I'm sure most of you will be aware of, is just the actual cost. The headline figure that's being thrown around for the construction and purchase of the submarines is $368 billion. Now, there's a point where you can just sort of shut your eyes and invent a figure once it gets past a certain amount. And it's certainly a very rubbery figure. When you try and drill into how they've actually calculated the 368, you won't actually find any sort of consistent methodology, at least on the public record. But we're talking about a massive amount of money, which very easily could transform public spending, education, health, workers' living standards, and so on. But instead, what Albanese has committed us to is a structural black hole in the budget for decades to come. A structural black hole which is going to say to Australian workers, as the crisis intensifies as a consequence of the current war, a black hole which will be used to further drive down living standards and cut back public services and so on. Now that's bad enough, but the crucial political issue is really the further integration of Australia into the US alliance, in which Australia already plays an important role through Pine Gap and Northwest Cape. The signals, for example, that were sent to the submarine which sank the vessel in the Indian Ocean came from Northwest Cape. Pine Gap, with its multiple signal bases there, was certainly central to the intelligence being used for the bombing campaign over Iran. And this strategic positioning of the alliance is shaped by the increasing geopolitical rivalry between the US and China, and the very real prospect of a war, in my view, over Taiwan. And there's going to be a separate session on Taiwan where some of these arguments can be rehearsed a bit more fully. It's also taking place in the context of global rearmament, which normalises increased defence spending and war as the inevitable and necessary outcomes of inter-imperialist rivalries and political crises. And I was just chatting to David beforehand, he's saying Trump's now coming up with a plan to ask, is that 40%?
Yeah, $1.5 trillion.
Yeah, Trump's now going to ask for a 40% increase in US defence spending over the next 12 months. I mean, since the second, these are the single largest standalone increases in defence spending since before the Second World War. Now, Australia participates in the US alliance as a willing and proactive junior partner, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Australia, and certainly the Morrison government behind the scenes, were actually pushing for the AUKUS deal. They weren't sort of rung up and said, oh, hey, do you want to sign on to this new plan we've hatched up? It was very much a situation where there was a division within the defence establishment and the intelligence establishment, and a section of that was pushing for the introduction of nuclear submarines, and the political opportunities coincided so that the agreement could be signed. Now, Australia participates in the US alliance as a willing and proactive junior partner. And it's a mid-range imperialist power in its own right. As a settler colonial state, has always sought to control and influence the Asia-Pacific region, and has used first the British and then the US alliances as an umbrella for doing this. There is a direct financial interest in Australia maintaining some influence and control over the region, both in the forms of trade. Trade routes currently through the Indo-Pacific are estimated about 1.2 trillion per annum. And as part of the wider US-China rivalry, Australia seeks to limit Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific, defending the strategic interests of Australian capitalism. We've seen that a lot in the aid programs and these Pacific conferences, and I'll come back to some of that a bit later on. Now, the broader strategic picture for implementing AUKUS was set out in a Defence Strategic Review in 2023, and this really solidified AUKUS as being as the centrepiece of Australia's long-term defence strategies. And I'll just quote parts of what the Strategic Review said. I mean, firstly, it's underpinned by the emergence of China as a key rival to US hegemony in the period since the Second World War. Now, it doesn't actually mention China very much in the review itself. It doesn't actually say the word China. But the way it's structured, it's very clearly implied that that's all it's going to be. And interestingly, the latest US Defence Review does exactly the same thing. They talk about which areas they want to control and assert their right to do it, but they don't actually say, this is because we're in opposition to China. You actually need to go one step further than that and actually have an analysis that understands imperialism and say, well, why are they doing this? And it's quite clearly only because, or primarily because, of the strategic rivalry with China. And I'll quote a couple of things from the review itself. It's premised on the idea, and I'll quote, the most challenging circumstances in our region, we're living in the most challenging circumstances in our region for decades, and the US is no longer the unipolar leader of the Pacific. It goes on to say the Indo-Pacific is the most important geostrategic region in the world, but because of the multipolar distribution of power, i.e. US versus China, there is no established regional security architecture. It goes on to conclude Australia's immediate region, encompassing the northeast Indian Ocean through maritime Southeast Asia into the Pacific, including our northern approaches, should be the primary area of military interest. So very much Well, it restates at some level what has always been the case in relation to Australian capitalism, but it's restating in a very specific context and making it very, very clear that Australia is linking itself to the US as part of a series of wider strategic interests in the region in opposition to China. The key strategic features of the review were these. Firstly, it redefined the concept of national defence. And I won't go into how that wordplay plays out, but essentially it calls for a sort of whole-of-nation strategy, which means combining government departments and government spending into seeing defence as one of their primary concerns when they actually construct their budgets. It talks about an enhanced, expanded alliance with the US, which is quite clearly the nuclear-powered submarines, and it's also calls for a further focus on deterrence and accelerated military preparedness. Now, what this means is an expansion and significant upgrade in the investment, or increases in the investment, to all of the armed forces and also to Australia's naval capabilities. So, for example, in relation to naval capabilities, not only is there the possibility of nuclear submarines docking in Australian ports, but you're seeing the upgrading of shipyards, such as the Osborne shipyard in Adelaide, to construct nuclear submarines. There's plans to construct a new East Coast facility for doing much the same, and increased visits from the US and UK, sort of cycling through on their normal process. What's the word?
Rotation.
Rotation is the word. Thank you, Peter. Second is the expansion of army capability. More heavy landing craft and long-range missiles are proposed, along with the industrial expansion in Townsville, where there's a major army base and army presence already, and also the expansion for industrial purposes along the east coast, and one of the sites being mooted, for example, is Nowra on the south coast. The third is the expansion of the Air Force, an enhanced network of northern bases, and the upgrading of the F-35 program. There are also other proposals around Space Command and cyber warfare, which I won't go over. But overall, what we're seeing proposed is a significant shift in military capacity to a long-term, unquantified increases to the military budget, and Australia very much locked in to a process of longer-term escalation of arms production and arms forces. Now, Albanese accepted all the recommendations in the review, and it's being used, as I said, to shape Australia's broader economic strategy, especially in the recalibration of manufacturing around defence industries and weapons exports. In fact, one of the key aims of the Albanese government is to go into the top 10 globally of export, manufacture and exports. And you get some sense of what this all means in practice during the recent South Australian election. Now, for those of you who don't know, I mean, South Australia in the post-Second World War period used to be a major centre of manufacturing in Australia. The car industry, much of the car industry was based there. Virtually all of the white goods industries were based there, and so on. And so the decline of those industries and the total closure of the car industry has led the South Australian government to look to ways of replacing those industries. And what they're seeing now, and what we're seeing now, is the way in which arms manufacture and the construction of nuclear submarines is very much at the centrepiece of the South Australian government's economic strategy. In the run-up to the election, Albanese announced that Albanese and Malinauskas, the South Australian Premier, announced that there would be a $30 billion investment in the Osborne plant, and which would create 10,000 jobs and 5,000 direct jobs. And at a conference to spruik this in February, Albanese said, "This is a driver not just of our national security and how we're going to defend our nation into the future, it is also a driver of our economic prosperity." Pat Conroy, from the Labor left, Minister for Defence Industries, says here, and this is at Osborne again, "It's a real pleasure to be here for this historic moment. We've got 100,000 patriotic Australians already working in the defence industry, and the AUKUS project will generate 20,000 more skilled jobs and highly skilled and secure jobs when this shipyard is constructed. It will be the only shipyard in the Southern Hemisphere capable of constructing nuclear power submarines. Under the visionary leadership of Prime Minister Albanese and the Premier, so it sounds like North Korea or something, this is truly becoming the defence state. Late last year I opened Australia's first missile factory in 60 years at Port Wakefield, and this is a defence future made in Australia through the ingenuity and hard work of South Australians and all Australians. Aussie, Aussie, Aussie. Peter Malinauskas at a separate press conference when he was asked in relation to the rise in the One Nation vote and the prospect of them getting a high vote, which turned out to be true, was asked what he had to say to One Nation voters in South Australia. And he said this in relation to claims that they should cut all migration. Who's going to feed you and bathe you and wipe your bum when you're 90? Because it ain't going to be your kids, because if I get my way, they're going to be working on submarines with high-paying jobs. And certainly not listening to Palestinian wolfers at writers' festivals either, I would have thought. What you're seeing here is an exhilarating vision of a state based on an entirely military economy with a two-tiered, racially stratified, casualised workforce. That's essentially what is being argued for in the context of a rising economic crisis and inflation crisis and so on. And this really indicates what the real meaning of a whole-of-government approach to national defence means. It means embedding it militarily, economically and ideologically at the heart of public policy. It might have short terms for Labor, but with increased it might have short-term electoral gains for Labor, but with increasing global instability, the talking up of military threats, especially from China, exacerbates fears, helps feed racism and underpins the shift to the far right. And we can see the way in which these shifts are occurring, not just in the electoral trends, but in some of the sort of public opinion surveys that are being conducted. There's a survey conducted by the National Security College, which at the ANU, which although it might have been a fairly self-serving survey in lots of ways, found highlighted a couple of important findings, I'd say. Firstly, that there's rising anxiety about national security, which increased from 42% of respondents in November 24 to 64% by February 2026. In July 2025, 68% of those asked considered it more likely than not that there would be conflict with another country in 5 years. 45% considered a military attack on Australia probable within 5 years. And so, there's a broader ideological frame being established here, which the push for militarisation is helping to feed, and it's one which is going to, further feed the far right and present considerable challenges for those of us on the left who want to try and oppose this. Okay, so how do we go about opposing this? Well, essentially, I'd suggest there are probably two main sets of arguments, and there's some overlap between them. The first is that AUKUS is just too impractical, too long-term. Trump and the British are too unreliable, unpredictable, and this just leaves Australia exposed. We need to sort of fill the gaps with more conventional weapons to make sure that, that we're safe. Now, these approaches don't challenge the US alliance itself. It doesn't call for the closure of Pine Gap or North West Cape, or even necessarily the participation, the sort of knee-jerk participation in wars such as in Iran and so on. It also calls for boosting military spending in other ways. So, for example, the Admiral Briggs, who I quoted at the start, instead of the 8 AUKUS submarines, called in the short term for the purchase of at least 10 nimble submarines, whatever that might be. Hugh White, a well-known defence analyst, who's quite hawkish on most defence questions, argued for, again opposed to the submarine deals, argued for a maritime denial strategy, which is exactly the same language used in the Strategic Review in 2023, to stop Asian powers sending military forces to Australia. This would involve the purchase of 200 fighter jets, 24 new submarines, and increasing defence spending to 3.5% from currently about 2.5%. So essentially what we're seeing with these sorts of arguments is essentially a different form of militarism that challenges none of the premises behind the current defence policy. Now, the more serious set of arguments that we need to deal with, which are those which have some purchase on the left, are what we can broadly describe as left nationalist approaches. And those approaches argue that Australia clings too closely to the US alliance. It makes Australia, in the event of a war with China, for example, a direct target if Australia has nuclear capacity, and especially as well if Australia has long-range attack capacity via its new missile program that's being proposed. Now, in many respects, we would agree with that, but there are a number of things that we need to, a number of caveats we need to put in place. First thing to say is that there was a time, 20, 30 years ago, where on the Labor left, defence policy was a point of difference. There was opposition to US bases, particularly from the Victorian Party. And there were significant campaigns around the US alliance, dating from the Vietnam War right through until the 1990s. But as Labor left declined for all sorts of other reasons, you find those views not so clearly expressed, but some of them are still around. The major thrust of the sort of, if you like, still the remaining left nationalist review is that there still needs to be some form of independent Australian foreign policy and defence strategy. This doesn't necessarily mean abandoning the US alliance, but it does put greater emphasis on diplomacy. Now, this approach was most recently theorised by an intelligent analyst, Sam Rogivan, for the Lowy Institute in a book he wrote called The Echidna Strategy. Now, the image of the echidna, for those of you who don't know, is when it's threatened, when you curl up in a ball when it's threatening a spike to come out. So the real debate is whether or not you can have an echidna strategy when you're already integrally tied into the US alliance. And the second thing is, how long are those spikes going to be, and who pays for the spikes, and so on. And so we want to sort of go through some of those arguments. Firstly, the echidna strategy has been taken up by a range of people who we could broadly describe as being on the centre left. Prominent Labor figures like Gareth Evans, former Foreign Minister, and more importantly, in terms of the people we work with on a day-to-day basis, by David Shoebridge and the Greens. And what the echidna strategy argues for is a more defensive approach, as I've explained, and backed by, and I'll quote, air, underwater, missile, cyber detection and destruction capabilities. In summary, spiky but unthreatening. It would involve the construction of an impenetrable defence, but no capacity for long-range strikes. Although, as I said before, there's quite a lot of debate about how long the spikes should be in order to fulfil the goals of this strategy. Now, there are three basic problems with this approach. Firstly, is it doesn't really dispense with the assumption, or potentially the reality, that Asian countries present a potentially existential threat, not necessarily through direct invasion, but through the disruption of trade, etc. For example, a war blocked the Malacca Straits. And in terms of imperialist rivalries, economic and geopolitical competition between states in the region and so on, it is those states, not US or Australian imperialism, who are being pitched and presented as the problem. Secondly, defending Australia ultimately translates into defending Australian business interests in the Asia-Pacific and Australian capitalism as a whole. Australian governments have always relied upon extensive diplomatic and military presence in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific region, and the creation of a buffer zone in order to, and I'll quote the Department of Defence here, protect the borders and maritime interests of Australia. Now, this involves, and this has always involved, but certainly involves at the current time, tying neighbouring states to Australian foreign policy through military and policing agreements and through foreign aid. And we've just seen, for example, last week, Thales over in Lithgow in New South Wales signing a contract to supply 3,500 machine guns to the PNG government. This would be quite consistent with the echidna strategy, as far as I can tell. Now, Gareth Evans, who I mentioned earlier, seeks to continue this pattern by arguing for much closer military ties with Indonesia in order to, as he puts it, lengthen the quills, which again would simply reinforce the military in Indonesia and the government in Indonesia, and including its occupation of West Papua, Indonesia's forward policing structure, and so on. And so it's essentially the maintenance and consolidation of the sort of sub-imperial zones which Australia is seeking to create in the region. The third objection is this, and that is, even if the US alliance is broken, which would be a huge, historic breakthrough, an independent Australian state would still operate to protect the interests of Australian capitalists. It would maintain regional security investment interests in the region, because Australian capital has always been reliant on these for trade and trade route access and so on. And ultimately it would subordinate the interests of Australian workers to the nation state and the ideologies of nationalism, which will be used to help hold down wages, cut services and so on as the economic crisis continues to bite. And that state has always been capable of waging war at home and abroad. The army exists as the ultimate force to police marginalised communities, to crush working class struggles, and to block radical social change. The army in the past, and most famously in the coal miners' strike in New South Wales in 1949, was sent in to break the strike. Much more recently, the army was sent in to occupy Aboriginal communities during the period of the Northern Territory intervention. And the army was used during the police lockdown in Western Sydney, during the COVID lockdown. They weren't cruising around Vaucluse and Double Bay, they were out in Bankstown, Punch Bowl and so on, policing in an openly racist way, the way in which the lockdowns were imposed. And so the army is always going to be potentially a measure of last resort, but certainly a measure of real resort for the Australian ruling class, operating its own independent state. I say so to wind up. I think we need to sort of look at how we can build opposition to AUKUS, but really I think this needs to be conducted on several levels. Firstly, we want to, there's an urgent need to sort of build a movement that opposes AUKUS and the growing militarisation that we're seeing here and globally. There's an urgent need for this to be a broader movement against imperialism and war, and to understand that the grinding wars and the genocide that we're seeing in Ukraine, Palestine, Iran and so on are stepping stones potentially to much wider and terrifying violence than we've already seen. And the problem we face is that the Palestine movement hasn't really translated into that sort of movement, and I'd really like to sort of hear some discussion from some of the people in the room here who've been involved in the AUKUS campaigns about how we might actually go about trying to do that. The second point about opposition to AUKUS is it must involve breaking all military ties with the US. An end to the bases, an end to the ports for the rotations, an end to the expanding numbers of US troops in the Northern Territory, and so on. But thirdly, in hoping to do that, building it through an internationalist current that sees the workers of China and Iran as potential allies of Australian workers in the fight for a democratic and peaceful world, not pitted against each other in the interests of their ruling classes, whether that's expressed through the acquisition of nuclear submarines or the more sort of softly language of the Echidna strategy. So to end on a couple of very well-known slogans, comrades, the main enemy is at home, workers of the world unite.